next distinguished guest is the poet, Richard Blanco.
One sun rose on us today, kindled over our shores, peeking over the Smokies, greeting the faces of the Great Lakes, spreading a simple truth across the Great Plains, and charging.
Hi, this is Richard Blanco, also known as Ricardo de Jesus Blanco Valdez Sanchez Molina, coming to you from my home in Maine, in a little town named Bethel, nestled in the western mountains. It's a far cry from my native Miami, and my Cuban roots, but nonetheless a wonderful place to write. This is, of course, my library, my office, my sanctuary, my little universe where all the writing gets done, where all the imagination is let loose. I'm so honored and excited that the DMA has invited me to write a poem for their current exhibit called Migration, which is just a wonderful title, which is currently on view at the Center for Creative Connections. You know, they say that every poet is in some ways writing one poem all their life. And of course, what that means figuratively, not literally, is that there's always some kind of central obsession, something really significant in a poet's life that somehow all their work sort of comes back to it in some ways. In some ways, their entire body of work is an attempt to address that obsession, to ask questions of that obsession, to answer them and ask new questions, a perpetual kind of exploration of that obsession. And of course, there is no resolution because that's why it's a subject of art. Art is not about finding a final answer, but about asking great questions, not about finding answers. And so for me, that obsession really comes down to one single word all my life. And that is home. Home, right? Home is a huge word. It's like asking what is love. Home and all that great big word calls into mind with respect to family, community, heritage, cultural identity, even sexuality, our sense of place, belonging, longing, all this great big massive stuff that centers on the word home. And it's really no wonder, actually, because as I like to say, I was made in Cuba, assembled in Spain, and imported to the United States, which means that my mother left Cuba when she was 7 months pregnant with me in 1968. We fled to Madrid. I was born there. And 45 days after my birth, we emigrated yet again to New York City at first. So when I pause and think about that, think about that kind of history, I realized that by the time I was 45 days old, I belonged to 3 countries, Cuba, Spain, and the United States. By the time I was 45 days old, I had lived in 2 world-class cities. By the time I was 45 days old, I had been born into 2 languages. I actually don't remember ever having a first language. To me, I learned English and Spanish simultaneously. I never remember not knowing both at any point in my life. And that was really kind of a sort of a foreshadowing again of this obsession that would come to inhabit my work, my very self, my very soul. In that story, eventually we moved from New York when I was 5 years old to Miami. And that kind of continued that obsession, or feeding that obsession in many ways. As we like to say in Miami, we love living there because it's so close to the United States. and you don't need a passport to get in. But the truth is, as I've always framed it, is that growing up in Miami was like growing up between two real imagined worlds. One, of course, was the one world was, of course, the 1950s and 60s Cuba of my parents and my grandparents and the whole exile community at large, right? This homeland that I was from, this place that I belonged to, this place we were going back to maybe someday, but I had never been there, right? I really had no memory of the place. I had sort of a cultural sense of the place, but I had no actual memories of the place. And the other real imagined world was something perhaps a little less obvious, which was the United States. Growing up in an isolated community, an isolated cultural community outside of the Miami-Dade County borders, so to speak, there was a whole other world that also was this sort of as imaginary to me as my parents' Cuba, right? This place that I also belonged to, this America that we were here, that we belonged to, but not quite a part of. I didn't see families like mine on television. We didn't eat the same foods on the TV commercials, et cetera, et cetera. So from a very early age, I was navigating sort of unwittingly or unconsciously or sort of at least being imprinted by this idea of these two worlds circling around me and belonging to both and to neither. And of course, that set the groundwork for this obsession and for what my work would become about when I eventually started writing much later in life. So as you can imagine or understand, I was very drawn to the migration exhibit, very inspired by it, and just really the poem just seemed so connected to everything that the exhibition spoke to. So of course I want to share the poem with you in a few minutes, but I just want to give you a little more background on myself and the poem and how it originated, what kind of thinking went into it and the creative process. Not sure if it's common knowledge, but in addition to being a poet, I'm also a civil engineer. I've been a practicing professional civil engineer all my life. And I've learned how to build bridges out of concrete and steel. But over the course of my life, I've also realized I've built other kinds of bridges with words and images. And it's kind of like what I'd like to call myself a poet engineer, which is a contradiction in terms, but nonetheless applies to me. In any case, thinking about my engineering and poetry and that combination and the poem that I created for the exhibition, there's also something else that I've sort of learned through my engineering and poetry, and the combination of the two. And that's that I feel that our sense of place, or sense of belonging or home, really is made up of two things, right? One is the physical landscape, the man-made world, that world that I can make, right, as an engineer, the buildings and the streets and the homes and the parks and whatnot. And that's a very important thing in our lives. We occupy space. We live our lives in three dimensions. Things happen in physical reality. But there's another kind of landscape, which is the landscape of poets. And that's the emotional landscape, that these objects, these places, these spaces that are physical really mean nothing until we have an experience in them, until we have memories in them. And for me, that kind of interesting dynamic of how these two things fit together, again, create that sense of home, place, and belonging. It's interesting that, in part, that's what I was thinking about in this poem. There are, of course, these objects in the exhibit, right? There's like the pitchers and the teacups and the rugs, and there's urns, and there's sandals, and there are objects hanging on the wall and display cases. And my poetic mind started thinking, okay, here are the tangible aspects of that, right? Here are the objects, the physical world, right? And then my poetic imagination just started diving into like, where were these lives? What are the stories behind these lives? What is the emotional landscape that colors these things? Of course, we may never know exactly, but that's part of what the poem is about. It's an act of imagination, of thinking about who walked over these rugs, who held these cups, who drank from them, over what dinner tables, what was going on, right? And sort of relating that to my own life. Given my life as an immigrant, as a child of exiles, I started thinking about, what about the objects of my life, and what would I take if I had to suddenly leave my home here in Maine, or leave this country, journey, in the same way like my mother did. My mother left Cuba literally in 24 hours notice, left her entire family behind. And I've gone over that reel in my head over and over again, thinking about, what was that last day like? What did she pack? What would she take with her? What would you leave behind? What can you take with you? What are the most important things? What are the objects, the physical objects, that will remind you of your emotional life of a place? And so in some ways, the poem is thinking about that connection, both from the point of view of me looking at the exhibit and imagining those lives, but then bringing it back in and saying, what would I do? What were the objects that would be on display someday in a museum, maybe, about my journey, about my leaving, right? So, yeah, that's a lot of what went into the poem. So it really is a combination of my poetic mind, my engineering mind, the idea of the landscapes, the physical landscapes, the emotional landscapes, the intersection of those two that ultimately tell a story. Though I can't hold or comfort the hands that once held these urns with their sons or mothers in ashes, nor behold the love in the eyes of the eyes that once beheld these vases abloom with roses. Though I can't drink the cascade of water or wine never poured for me from the mouths of these pitchers, nor kiss the lips that kissed these teacups, only savor the emptiness of these empty plates and hollow bowls, with swirls of glazed flowers gazing back at me now. Though I can't chart the dreams once dreamed underneath the geometry of these blankets, nor caress the shoulders that donned these silk robes like butterflies' wings fleeting into the sun. Though I can't alight myself to some other time, nor trace the footprints of lives erased from these rugs, though I can't wear these tattered sandals or see the souls who wore down these souls on their journeys, I can still imagine them, as I imagine myself like them, someday having to cross continents to dodge dying in the crossfire of a revolution, board a ship to save my genes from genocide, or thrash through raging whitewater to calm my ache of famine in a land of plenty and promise. Imagine what I'd take, not just to keep me alive, but to keep my life alive. My salt, my spices, to taste who it was I am. A handful of seeds to plant my favorite fruit, take root, claim some new earth. My dead father's watch still ticking with his life. my favorite coffee mug to watch my ghost rise in its steam. Imagine what I don't know I'll need as much as I will. My journal, bookmarked by a petal between the last scribble of who I was and blank pages of who I'll be. The front doorknob I'll never turn again. A photo album my eyes will turn to greet lost faces. Imagine what only my mind could pack. My wind chimes giggles, train whistles, a neighborhood dog's yowls, the purr of night winds through my garden. A breath of the winds I breathed, the dust of my footsteps that might have blanketed my bones sleep. The altar of mountains my eyes will never praise again. Memories of clouds I told my secrets to. Imagine how I'd scatter them into a new sky, transform the beauty of loss and loss of beauty into the art of a new life. Oh, the sweet arias of rain recomposed over a new rooftop, the stars I'd redraw into the constellation that guided me to my new elsewhere. Imagine the moon in the ear of some new window, whispering the poems I'd write to render myself at home again. In a new house of words that someday someone might read and imagine the story of their migration in my gration. There you have it. Of course, there's a kind of irony in that poem these days when we can't migrate, when we're sheltered in place, when we can't move anywhere. And it makes me think about the primordial drive of human beings to always move, to always explore, to always connect, to always find new places, new people, new communities, and how we can't do that right now. And yet, it's still, I think it's underlying all of what we're going through. I think at the core of everything is that inability to move, to connect, to explore, to think about new possibilities. And for me personally, I think that's one of the things I'm most having difficulty with, is not being able to be at the DMA, not being able to connect with my audiences, not even being able to shake hands and explore lives and new communities and think about possibilities and how we belong, how we all belong in different ways to different places. So, in any case, to bid you farewell, I just wish you all the best in your migrations, in your journeys, whether past or present in some ways, or in the future. And I hope that our journeys cross again soon.